going to throw to I'm going to throw to you, Tammy Jonas. And for anyone who's just joined us, Tammy is the president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, does some amazing work, incredible activism. Tammy, why are we here tonight? Why is it important that we gather and discuss these issues? What's happening?
Great. Thanks, Alex. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded lands of the Djadja Wurrung and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to any other Indigenous Australians who are here tonight. The UN Food Systems Summit, well, actually, I'd first like to say welcome to the Afsa Solidarity Session. We've been running these since the start of the pandemic, and it's turned out to be a great way to get people together who actually find it hard to get together very often. And so in a way, it's been a gift. But of course, I wouldn't have asked for a pandemic to see you more often in these ways. So we have a whole YouTube channel where the recordings of the Solidarity sessions are. And I encourage people to go and have a look at the other ones if you're interested. I think Amita will start putting things in the chat for links for those sort of things. In terms of why we're here tonight and the UN Food Systems Summit, in 1996, they had the first UN Food Systems Summit, and then the second one was in 2007. And those were legitimate processes that were run by the World Committee for Food Security, and which has participation from civil society through something called the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. So these are platforms where those who are most marginalized and who have a stake in what happens in the food system are there as equal kind of participants in discussions about what needs to happen to radically transform our food systems to make them fair. In this case, the newest Food Systems Summit, which is happening tomorrow, it started actually in 2019. It started with a fairly terrible partnership with the World Economic Forum, which represents the world's biggest 1,000 corporations. So the likes of Bayer and Cargill are the ones being represented through that partnership. They formed the partnership and then announced they were going to start a process towards a UN Food Systems Summit, and they basically put the wolves in charge. I mean, the corporations in charge. So in doing that, they appointed a special envoy to lead the process. And that person is somebody called Agnes Kalibata, who leads the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, which has a long history of trying to introduce more and more biotech to Africa, and to the detriment of the small-scale farmers there. It's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, both of which support big tech solutions to global food systems problems. In the case of, like, if you wonder whether Bill and Melinda Gates have perhaps done more good than we would give them credit for, because why would you pick on them? They give billions of dollars away every year, right? In the case of Agra, where they've spent about $1 billion in funding, the countries that they operate in have actually seen a 30% rise in food insecurity. So it's not in question whether or not the work they're doing is not helping the people of the country. So that's who's been coordinating all of the work towards this Food Systems Summit. It's those bodies, basically. And in the lead up to the summit, there have been the independent dialogues, the national dialogues, and the global dialogues. And again, in theory, anyone can participate in these, but they're mostly led by corporations. And what the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, has told us is that there's been nothing substantive from the actually independently organized dialogues, including some of which have taken place here in Australia. I've in fact attended some to just see what was being discussed. We boycotted the national one that was organized by the CSIRO. They invited us, and we stayed in solidarity with the peasants and Indigenous peoples of the world in boycotting those events. But that work has not gone on to meaningfully contribute to the action tracks and things that are now being developed. So I'll jump to where we are now, instead of boring you with the entire 2 years of this process, where it was really difficult for the global activists to make a decision to boycott the process, because we've been in the UN spaces for 25 years. The food sovereignty movement has not turned its back on UN processes before. We've organized counter-mobilizations, but we've always participated. And so it was quite a long and drawn out decision to boycott this particular process, because we worked out that our presence was there to greenwash their work, and it would legitimize what is not legitimate work. So in the final work that's happening, they've come up with 4 levers of change, selected by the Secretariat from a process that nobody's quite sure how they came up with it. But just to give you an idea of how captured this process is, those 4 levers of change are innovation, and that's being led by the World Economic Forum. So that's who's drafting the what are they calling it, a compendium of information on innovation. Investment is being led by the World Bank. Gender is being led by the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then human rights is bizarrely being written by a consultant that was hired by the General Secretary of the UN. Like, they have a human rights council, and they've hired and they have special rapporteurs on all manner of human rights, and they've chosen a consultant to write it. So that's strange. So what will happen is that tomorrow there's a one-day event. They've done 2 years of planning. They had a pre-summit event over 3 days, and we had a counter-mobilisation to that. And now tomorrow, the whole 2 years culminates in, looks like just one day, but it's not, because now we go into the national pathways. And the work for the national pathways has started with these compendiums in the 4 action areas. And those national pathways, in theory, are not so bad, because they will give us national processes towards national food plans. Very few countries have national food plans, including ours. Australia doesn't have one either. Afsa was actually founded around the first attempt at a national food plan here in 2010 to 12. When the Green Paper came out in 2012 is when Afsa incorporated and did the People's Food Plan. In fact, there are a number of people who are here today who were part of that process in developing the People's Food Plan. So now they will come back for a national food plan again, which sounds good. But the first draft of that that's coming from this process has been written by the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, and IFPRI. So it's a really worrying way to start a national food plan process. But then in this counter-mobilisation, I guess what we're doing with all of you here today is helping share more information about what can we do about that. And 10 years later, Afsa does have a seat at tables when there's government policy being developed around food and agriculture systems. And so does Right to Food Coalition, I know, puts in submissions on government policy processes. And there are others. So we are so much more organized than we were 10 years ago. And we're ready for this. There are other countries who aren't as ready, and we have to stand in solidarity with them too. But I guess that's enough of a background for me on how we got here.
Thank you so much, Tammy. And for those of you who have joined us a little bit later, welcome. I'm Alex Stewart, your host, and we have some esteemed panel members that are going to help bring, I guess, to life what Tammy has talked about, in the sense that we're going to hear from numerous different types of voices on how access to food and food sovereignty plays out in different sectors, whether you're an urbanite, whether you're a lower socioeconomic disadvantaged person in society, whether you're a regenerative farmer, or whether you are one of our First Nations peoples. So welcome to everybody. Thank you. I can see everyone's very well versed in these large scale Zoom meetings, and everyone has their mics off. There will be a little bit of time for questions at the end, of course, which I will invite you by name to take your microphone off, turn your microphone on for that. And we really appreciate you having your mics off. I can see some of you have video off, which means there may be children flying around the background, or people preferring not to wear pants. I appreciate in both scenarios you having your cameras off. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And Tim Mccartney, I'm going to ask you a question first. So Tim is on the board of the Barangi Gadjin Land Council and has the authority to speak on behalf of the Watchabollock people, and also provides some insights as a First Nations person. Tim, I want to ask you, what does the corporate co-optation of food systems mean for First Peoples? When you have seen this shift, as has happened with the UN Food System Summit this year, I mean, that would have obviously been quite an emotional roller coaster to witness such a thing. And I'd love for you to just speak on how you feel that might be impacting Indigenous people around the world.
Thanks, Alex. I suppose it is, sovereignty of us as First People of this land is something that's never been ceded, and our sovereignty and our connection to our food, our plants, our country is integral to who we are. It does sort of write about that the power system is still unbalanced in how we push forward in regenerating our country with our endemic species to provide sustainable food sources for our community, but for the wider community as well. We know that the native food industry is an emerging industry, or re-emerging industry in this country, but the government still have not addressed at a national or a state level about the inequity that exists within that. And you need to have access to land to create wealth, and that is the one thing as First Nations people across this country that was stripped of us, our inherent right and our connection to land and country. And we're fortunate in Victoria where we are that we've pushed forward for a traditional and a native food and botanical strategy to start to look at those and the systemic changes that need to happen. But these conversations need to happen at a federal, Commonwealth level as well. The call for Australia to adopt the Nagoya protocols on access and benefit sharing, the call on protecting in our legal framework around our cultural intellectual property are two fundamentals in our access to land. What unfortunately happens in this area here with food, and with us as First Nations people, and especially for what we want to do on my country, the Watchabalik country, we are wanting to push forward to reinstill our native plants in the landscape. We've seen our region here is $1 billion cropping industry with private landholders who are farming introduced species, which are having a tremendous effect on our country, our environment. And this is a real bit for us about how do we actually start to do that, because unfortunately we have to cede some of our control in this because we don't have the wealth base to be able to purchase land. So we are looking at partnering, and partnering doesn't necessarily mean that it's always equal footing. And that's a real challenge for us, but we're grateful that these conversations are happening now. We feel like there is a bit of a shift from a national standpoint as well. And I sit on as the Victorian Director on the First Nations Bush Food and Botanicals Alliance, the first of its type, that puts First Nations people first to push for these national agendas. Previously that was all done with ANFAB, that was the advocacy body, but it didn't have the voice of First Nations people at the forefront. And the only way that we do that is through self-determination, and that's us controlling our own destination.
And Tim, can I ask, for the average Joe out there who hears you speak and thinks, I want to help this person and the cause, what can everyone do?
I think it's about looking about what for us at the moment, it's about platforms to be able to have these conversations around partners. And resources are always a big thing. From a national body point of view, we're very poor, and groups like this would understand that there's just not a lot of resources around to be able to do this work, but it takes time and money. And when you've got organisations like the UN that identify it takes time and money, but then they prioritise the top 2% of people and not the other 98%, that's the real challenge in there. We're finding that around, getting our foods recognised as foods means that we have to partner with research groups that don't necessarily have the right agreements in place and take away our cultural intellectual property. There have been numerous occasions of plants from our country that have been marketed and commercialised overseas, and because of the laws that don't protect that. And there's real opportunity that we can actually, there's of we can farm our country better, providing more sustainable food sources whilst not farming every inch of our country to the nth degree. You know, better return on investment, better biodiversity and ecology, you know, and that we actually can start to address some of the climate challenges that are coming our way as well.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and it really speaks to me. When we think about what we can all do, and often people on these calls, you know, we're all drinking the Kool-Aid already. We all know what we want to do and how we want to do it, but it's about growing that voice. And often people who aren't on the calls, if they could actually hear some of the issues, they would fall in love with that cause and think, I want to make more of that happen. And so we've all got a responsibility there to not just get pumped up by hearing a conversation like this tonight and going, yay, I got to hang with my people for an hour and it feels really energizing, and then go back to normal. We actually need to say, yay, there was this amazing Zoom. And if I could just convince 2 or 3 mates to have a listen, or my social media community to have a listen to the recording, and just see how many more people we can get on board, really. So we run out of screens on the screens to invite people to these Zooms. So I want to hand over to Vivian Yee now, who is from the Right to Food Coalition. And Vivian, you've got a particular passion for access of food in lower socioeconomic areas, in remote areas. And I want to ask you, for people who are experiencing vulnerability when it comes to food, and not just food, but nutrition insecurity, because that's huge. You know, often, and I've been to some remote areas where you chat to the guys who are running the food bank there, and it's like 2-minute noodles and, you know, things that are just not giving those nutritional building blocks. So that's a huge part of this as well, where we say, yeah, it's great that Big Food is donating things, but at the same time, is that actually food for humans to thrive? No, it is not sometimes, actually, oftentimes. So Vivian, how is this corporatization going to impact food insecurity?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I guess first just want to also acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, lands that was and always will be Aboriginal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people who are speaking, attending today, or who might be listening to a recording of this event later. I think also just to acknowledge that in this conversation that, you know, it is a result of colonization and historical and ongoing injustices that food sovereignty and the right to food for First Nations people has and continues to be violated. It absolutely hasn't been respected or fulfilled or protected across this continent, and that First Nations people should be front and center in these conversations about food and nutrition and security. But I guess in answering your question, Alex, just to put into context the perspective that I'm speaking from. So I'm a public health nutritionist. I've been working in the food relief sector for a number of years. I'm not someone who's personally had to go through, you know, without food at this stage in my life. So anything that I'm sharing in terms of these issues or about what we can do does come from listening as deeply as possible to those sorts of demands and desires that you sort of touched on, expressed by people who do have lived experience of these things that we're talking about today. So I guess in terms of corporate co-optation and what that might mean for people experiencing food and nutrition insecurity, a major example is the main way that these issues are being currently addressed in Australia, and that's by relying on corporations, so major supermarkets, multinational food companies, to donate what they can't or won't sell to meet an extremely high level of immediate and chronic community need for food relief. And, you know, the majority of people who are experiencing food and nutrition insecurity would be interested in accessing delicious and nourishing and ethically produced types of food all of the time, like us. But when times are tough and say they do need access to food relief, often already with, you know, that impact on their sense of dignity, because there's a lot of shame and stigma associated with accessing relief. There's largely a shortage of the types of food that people want to eat. that sort of fresh, nutritious and nourishing food. If there is any fresh produce at all, it's typically very, very poor in terms of quality and variety. And there can be an oversupply of ultra-processed foods or gluts of rejected product lines. So you mentioned the 2-minute noodles, Alex. I've heard stories about pina colada Tim Tams not selling well a Christmas before, and food banks ending up with tons of that sort of product. And so that's an issue for someone who's accessing one-off emergency relief, and it's even more so for the growing proportion of people who can't access enough food. That would ensure that good quality of life, who are experiencing that on an ongoing basis, and that's a growing proportion of people. And I think that really the stress and, quite frankly, the violence of having that right to food violated can't be understated. And I think it shouldn't be normalized and minimized sometimes in the way that it is now, with shiny photo ops and halos for the corporations and sometimes governments who would just like us to see them as the good guys when they make their donations. I don't think that this quote solution that's so reliant on corporate goodwill is good enough, but I think that we're told that it is. I do also want to make clear that, formats of food relief and mutual aid that are founded on true solidarity, generous sharing of resources and redistribution of resources that are run by communities, I think that, respect choice and provide culturally appropriate relief, they're important and necessary. But I think that's different to this sort of main and false narrative and solution that we have in place now, where our only choice as a sector is to provide other people's so-called waste from a system that people can't afford to buy from in the first place. And so I guess I think about how much are corporations really helping if they donate food, if they're, say, undermining workers' rights or refusing to pay fair and living wages, refusing to support stable and secure employment, or not paying their fair share of taxes. I think you see major supermarkets spruiking food rescue efforts, but how many times have they also been exposed for underpaying staff, not to mention their very long history and ongoing practices of placing impossible pressures on our food system. And so I think to address food and nutrition insecurity properly, things that we could do would be to have adequate social support payments that are above the poverty line, basically everything that you can think of that would allow people to meet their basic needs. So affordable housing, strong workers' rights, supporting food sovereignty and the rights of peoples and communities to collectively determine their food systems. And yeah, in a nutshell, I suppose, corporate co-optation that promotes anything else as a false solution. I think that really just lets corporations and governments off the hook if those other things aren't the sorts of things that we're demanding for ourselves and fellow community members instead.
Absolutely, Vivian. And I think having visited and worked with some of the communities you're talking about over the years, something that really shocked me was there's no shortage of land, backyards, verges, which Costa will no doubt speak to coming up, where if we had the education that's often been lost through the generations on how to grow food, how to keep chickens, the mind boggles as to how easy and cheap it could be for countries to give power to the people to create very localized food systems themselves. So thank you for that detailed answer, and it really gets the mind thinking about how we can all start to, even start to think about politicians that might even have an inkling of sympathy towards these issues, and starting to open up those dialogues and chat to them and see how we can grow the voice however we can, both in urban and regional areas. Now, speaking of regional areas, it's time to speak to a farmer. Hello, Charlie. How are you?
G'day, Alex. I'm well, thank you. Yes, I nearly didn't get. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. So Charlie Arnott, for anyone who hasn't met him, is huge in the education space, supporting farmers to ditch their synthetic inputs, learn more about various forms of regenerative agriculture focused on biodynamics specifically, because that's your particular passion and how you converted your family farm after generations of conventional farming. Charlie, how is this all affecting regenerative farmers? What are the conversations on the ground? especially broadacre farmers, as you see the multinational impacts on commodity inputs and markets? What does this conversation look like for you guys at the moment?
It's a great question, and I've got 4 minutes to try and answer it.
Don't worry, no one else stuck to 4 minutes, so I'll give you 6.
Which is a bit mean, but I'm glad I had a bit of time to think about it, because I've tried to sort of keep it reasonably simple. So for me, and I'm thinking regenerative farming and broadacre farming, how I've sort of broken it down, how this is sort of playing out in my mind, and certainly in the paddocks between people's ears and literally in their fields, is, you know, what we're seeing with this sort of hijacking of this of the UN food system summit, and who's pulling the strings, is for them it's all about supply. Okay, and what and what does that mean? Well, it's really about quantity of food. It's about yield. How do they increase yield? Well, it's all about inputs. Who's behind that ties in really nicely with the people who are pulling the strings in this whole thing, because they're the people who are supplying a lot of the inputs. So it's in their best interest to promote agriculture, promote production of food on small and large scale that relies on them, like Bayer, for the inputs. Okay, so that's as far as a farmer being sovereign as you can possibly be. And that that supports a commodity mindset. We are growing stuff just to sell, and I used to be one of them many years ago. And so I understand the pressures we were under. We were relying on people like Bayer and a whole lot of the other puppet masters for our inputs. And it's a very prescriptive kind of agriculture. It's like, here are the inputs you'll need, and as long as you can produce some crap out the other end, you'll get paid for it. And what happened at the other end, we were price takers, not price makers. So to try and summarize what the agendas are at play here, it's all about supply, quantity, a commodity mindset, the inputs involved, and a very prescriptive way to do things. And that removes the thinking, removes decision making, and again steps us way away from any sort of any notion of sovereignty of one's farm, of one's business, of one's life, and because our life is farming, we live on our farms. So when we're abdicating responsibility in all those areas, in some people's mind that makes it easier to produce food, but in my mind and people who are doing things naturally, it's as far from where we want to be as possible. So what's the flip side to that? We need to create a demand economy. Okay, we need to create the demand from people, the eaters, to actually demand good quality food, nutrient-dense food. How do we do that? Well, we focus on quality. We focus on the inputs that are leading to better quality food, and they generally don't come from the people, the puppeteers, right? They're the people who. It's about making your own compost. It's about supporting people and making your own worm oil, whatever those inputs are. And generally, they're very much cheaper. Okay, and you can make a lot of this stuff on farm. And biodynamics and what we do is a really good example of that. We stop thinking about being commodity farmers, right? Because when you're a commodity farmer, all you're thinking about is you're not actually thinking that the food you're growing is going to feed someone and support their health, right? We've got to change our mindset about we're actually growing food to feed people. It's going to support their health and support the health of their children. And when you make that decision and that distinction, it changes everything and every decision you make. In terms of the what's the opposite of inputs? Well, it's outputs. We're focusing on quality. We're focusing on who we're selling it to, and we're getting back to creating a demand. And how do we create a demand? We tell a story. We tell a story of food. Big corporates. Their story is about what they're going to tell their shareholders. The story that farmers can tell is about the blood, sweat, and tears. Well, not all the bad stuff. I mean, that's half the equation, but it's their love of their land. It's the stewardship of their land. It's the involvement of their family, and it's their appreciation, gratitude for the eaters who are supporting them, and more directly, a direct line of sight. And what's the opposite of prescriptive agriculture? Well, it's adaptive agriculture. We're taking hold of our decision making. We're sourcing inputs, and we're making decisions. and we're adapting practices to our system and our farm, and we are being sovereign in doing that, because we're not relying on someone with all the answers and all the inputs. We're creating our own, and we are creating our own destiny by doing that. You know, so the further we can get away from relying on the big corporates, the multinationals, the people who seem to have hijacked this whole thing, that will retain and improve and regenerate our sovereignty. And that's the kind of food system we should be looking at. And it's not about a national food plan. I think it's about a local food plan. And that's, I do some work with Harris Farm, and I help verify their producers, and they're about soil health, product health, people health, environmental health, and rural community health. Now, those 5 pillars, cornerstones, will not appear on any vision of any of the people who are currently pulling the strings on this thing, and that is something I don't want to have anything to do with. So, I hope that was clear.
No, I know what you're saying, Charlie, and I think what you're trying to say there is that while the national picture doesn't look great and does look highly corporatized, we can take comfort in our personal circles of influence, whatever they look like right now, to create something really good on the ground. And as that web builds, things start to look better overall, to the point where the national picture has to actually start to pay attention to what we're all doing.
Totally. It's a big responsibility for farmers to bear, whether you're talking, and I look at sort of the climate crisis and the climate situation. You talk to farmers about them being responsible for that and them needing to sort it out. Man, that's a big ask. But if you just focus on farmers adapting practices, changing the paddock between their ears, thinking about creating the demand, thinking about the quality of their food within the boundary of their farm, man, that's really achievable. And if every farmer or every second farmer started doing that, right, that's when this becomes a national movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I always like to say we've got to move away from what's shiny and new to what's good and true, and just start developing those direct lines of conversation with people who produce, and start producing ourselves, which leads me so perfectly onto you, Costa Georgiadis. How are you this evening?
Good, Alex. Good, really good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Costa, an amazing horticulturalist, incredible presenter who literally lights up the screens across Australia, getting us all inspired about plants every single week. If not every day, on your socials. Thank you so much for your constant energy to get people excited about growing stuff and composting. I want to ask you, Costa, this is such a big global issue to see this push towards a corporatized, hyper-corporatized food system. Yet you and your conversation is always about what the one person in the city, in the country, doesn't matter where you are, can do today. You're so focused on lighting up that individual person. How do you feel this hyper-corporatization is going to affect us? What do you see needing to happen more than ever in urban dwelling spaces?
Okay.
And you've got 6 minutes too.
Yeah. 7-Eleven, okay. 7-Eleven of all places, okay. Well, that's what my clock says. It's probably 10 minutes fast, just to allow for Greek time in my world. Thank you for the opportunity to come and chat with everyone today. Relative to everyone else, I'm up here in Sydney on Gadigal and Bidigal land of the Eora, and I acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and listening to everything that we've been talking about, whether it was Tim or Viv or just now Charlie. We're talking about the fact that we are all connected to this land and to this country, and from that connection going right back beyond Tim and the First Nations connection to country, to Viv's connection to food and country in the work that she's doing, and then Charlie's work on farms on the land. We're all the same, that's how I see it, no matter who I'm speaking to, because we all have this same innate connection to the land which grows the food. But I think, to begin to answer the question and thinking about it over the last week or so, you know, what does it mean to urban dwellers, where, you know, the reality is that 80% of the people live in urban environments along predominantly the east coast of the country, with the exception of a few other areas. But people live in towns, they live in villages, they live in big cities. And I think getting into this idea, I was thinking, well, to me, what it means is that as this context increases, as this movement of people gets more and more hyper-focused, it means a greater distance and separation from people and their food. Charlie's talking about that immediate connection between the farmer and their land, but from the consumer's point of view, what this is doing is creating a deeper immersion into the concept of convenience, where it becomes the zone of the specialists, where the authority, leave it to us. We will bring in what's needed because we are telling you that this is what's on now. And I think what that means to the people receiving the food is that they then get wound into this narrative. And Charlie, you were talking about the narrative, and Viv, you were too, in terms of the narrative, that we go into this spiral around the world of cheaper and lower prices, this race to the bottom when it comes to the price being the cohort and the driver of city populations and their connection to the food they eat. And Charlie mentioned it in the context of commodities. It just, the more there's this chase your tail, because the more there is, the lower the price goes. The less there is, people get a little bonus for a few years, but then there's a glut, and you know, there's this cycle. And we get the extending and growth of this middle layer of manufacturers who transform and translate ingredients by bulk purchase. And so food becomes this battle of ingredients, and taste becomes a laboratory-driven race to replace ingredients with textures, tastes, flavors that come from the cheapest and or the waste ingredients and constructs. And it's a case of food becomes this commodity that knows no real local seasonal nuance. And things become available 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that narrative that has been spoken about, the actual food story of food, loses its identity, and it becomes greenwashed into a narrative that bypasses the natural processes behind the growing of anything. You know, whether it's broadacre or whether it's small scale. And so food becomes produced almost for the plastic tray that it'll be presented in the super fast market, injected with colours or liquid to increase its weight or improve the colour and appearance of substandard ingredients. And so ingredients become the basis of decision making, even though the ingredients are not promoted, because what's being promoted is this convenience. We're doing it for you. You don't have to cook. You can buy an apartment now that doesn't even have a kitchen, because you just get it in. And look at what's happened over the last 2 years. Whereas getting food in was almost like a little, we just do it once a week when we've had a big week and it's Friday night and we'll just get some pizzas in. Now there's this whole army of people being underpaid delivering food that's being presented in plastic containers, and chefs having to cook food that isn't how they want to present it. So urban dwellers become this destination, a dumping ground for the tweaks and twists and mixers, ERS, and mixers of a daily menu label that drives the whole story around food supply. And with this comes food grown and traded across massive distances, deals done that blow the bottom out of the markets for the sake of the chosen deals and trades, the dumping of cheap produce onto markets, which wipes out the narrative of the local market because of backroom deals done and dusted out of sight. What can people? So yeah, I'll wind down by saying, yeah, I think we have this opportunity with the urban dwellers, and that's my opportunity that I see every day to tell this story, but to make this story. And I can go into that with our next question, that there is this opportunity and we need to connect with people and draw into the conversation and speak in firsthand personal position and experience to enable people to come in and not have them overwhelmed by a narrative that is hard to connect to when you've been marketed the exact opposite.
100%, 100%. And really, it's about knowing how to connect the urban person to nature's marketing calendar, like to dial that back in.
And that connection to nature doesn't even have to be around everything that we're talking about today. That doesn't need to be the clobber to start the conversation. The conversation should start about, oh, here, try this, I grew this, or, oh, have you seen this blue-banded bee, and let's build a garden and reconnect with nature and watch the local bandicoots come back. And so there's ways that we need to create the trust, to build the conversation and share the story, and then we change the story.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Costa. Always G'ing us up. Tammy, I want to ask you, for the small scale farmer, we've talked urban, we've talked broadacre. There are many small farms who I've spoken to a lot of small scale farmers over the years on my show, researching for my book, who feel like rights dwindle left, right, and centre over the years. You can't have a local abattoir. You can't, so many rights have evaporated over the years. You can't just sell some milk to a farm, to a, family up the road. It's just crazy how rule driven the smallholder farmer is these days. How are you guys navigating that? And how can we bring some power back into that space?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, because we have a sort of nascent movement of back to small scale farming in Australia, but we're not very big yet. There's not that, like, as a movement, there aren't that many of us yet. And the barriers are the stuff like what's coming out of the UN Food System Summit. It's the likes of JBS buying up all our abattoirs. And so I'll illustrate the problem with something happening right now, which is that JBS, in fact, which is the largest meat processor in the world, has just put in a bid to buy actually the abattoir that we use, and here in Victoria, well, two, in fact, one on the border with New South Wales, but that's a vertically integrated one, so nobody can use that except Rivoli, their own company. And the one outside of Melbourne is available for private kills for small scale farmers. JBS's history is to buy up abattoirs and then stop doing slaughter for private kills. So they start doing only their own vertically owned supply chain. In Colorado, they bought a lamb abattoir that was processing like 30% of American lamb meat, and then they stopped processing lambs and shifted to only beef, and just took away that option for all the people who were using that facility. So they have a pretty big track record. Now, I actually just before copied something. Here's a nice little thing from the JBS website showing that they're at the Global Food Summit. They're at the UN Food System Summit.
Of course they are.
They've got equal footing, because it's all about participation, right? Equal participation for everyone. Mm-hmm. So they'll be right in there telling us that the people we need, the small scale farmers need, is them to do processing for us, but they just make decisions on profits for shareholders, not on what people need to be able to eat food. So these feel like big insurmountable problems, but they're not when you actually get the numbers together, as in collectivize. So that's why Afsa has been hosting these solidarity sessions, to help people understand more about these problems in the food system, and also to help us better collectivize our efforts. It's why we reached out across a wide range for who's here today, to make sure we're representing diverse voices and diverse perspectives that all kind of speak for and with different constituencies across the food system, because that's the only way we're going to beat the likes of JBS and the World Economic Forum, is if we speak together. So we don't have to say the same things, but we certainly need to be talking with each other. And there's a lot of really interesting work that I won't share around how you can achieve policy reform. And one of those things is about developing shared narratives. So if Right to Food and Afsa and Costa and Charlie and Tim are out there speaking with similar language about food sovereignty and about, rather than food security, we talk about hunger and food and nutrition security, and we talk about food sovereignty with agency for those who need food. If we're all using that same language when we work with government, when we send in policy submissions, or when we meet with our local members, then we start to have an impact. And we can say in the 10 years since Afsa was formed, we have achieved policy reforms in a number of spaces, and we continue to. We're now on their, direct dial list for AgVic, at least, where something goes wrong, they call it, not just goes wrong, when they start a policy development process, they ring us, they say, you're an identified constituency, we need to know how this will impact on your members. And same with, they invite us to put in things like the JBS acquisition. The ACCC sent us things saying, as a stakeholder, do you want to put in something? We don't have to wait to find out about it. That only happens because we have a lot of people working together and using the same messaging around these things all the time. So exactly as Costa said, just making it understandable to people, and then bringing people in together so that we're actually speaking under organizations that can represent us through democratic means.
And Tammy, would you say that this is a good time to plug joining Afsa and becoming a member?
I mean, I think some people have been doing it.
Is it ever a better time than now, right?
There's never a better time than now. The right time to join was yesterday. Yep. The next best time is today.
Yep. We have the link in the chat. You can see Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance to everyone. It's been posted about 10 up from the most recent chat. Some really great comments coming through in the chat. First, I want to just thank each of you for speaking to those different areas of this conversation. It's so important that we keep the diversity of voice in these conversations. I noticed someone just popped in the chat there, Georgie, no more food systems work or advocacy without the presence of farmers. So important. So thank you to all of you. Really, really enlightening, insightful, and empowering. Now, I want to just pick up a couple of questions here in the chat. Actually, no, more. Most people aren't asking questions in the chat. They're just saying, yeah, like they're just Costa, go, preach. There are no questions at all. So if anyone would like to ask a question, this would be a really good time to pop it in the chat. I'm going to ask a couple of questions now that I've heard everyone speak, while we wait for some questions to come through. A question for you, Charlie, on the narrative at the moment that's coming out of this corporatization of things like the UN Food System Summit, the narrative that to tread lightly, we have to move away from animal agriculture. To tread lightly, we have to start, farming monocultures and do everything to get the most amount of food to feed the most amount of people. And so we then get a lot of food companies trying to tell us the story we want to tell ourselves, which is I'm being a good human, right? And so I'm being a good human by buying these processed nuggets of strangeness. Now, I'm never against however anyone wants to eat. That is absolutely everybody's choice. I have vegan friends, vegetarian friends, keto friends. I don't care, but I think we can all overlap in knowing what's best for the land by talking to farmers, literally seeing those transformations in the way you're farming now versus how you used to farm. Can I just ask you, in terms of biodiversity, what are some of the most important things in farming? Because that's something we all really want more of. We know we want more biodiversity. We know we want the land to be healthier. What have you noticed as a farmer are some of the most important changes that can be made towards those goals, regardless of however someone then chooses to eat from those food systems in the end?
Well, I guess you said the word that sprang to mind. Biodiversity is key, and I guess what is the most biodiverse system on the planet? It's a natural system. And why is it biodiverse? Because nature, by definition, has to. It's about building resilience into a system. And to do that, we need every single player to be playing their part in that system, whether it's the fungus in the ground, or it's the birds in the trees, or it's the bats, whatever. So if we look to nature for inspiration, that's how we build resilience into our farms. And so what do? We have animals and we have plants. Back to your question or your opening sort of line about pressure on farmers or food producers to get away from animals. I mean, there's no system, there's no place on earth where animals don't coexist with plants. So they have evolved together. So if we're looking to nature for inspiration, we have to incorporate animals. I believe we have to incorporate, or it's best practice to incorporate animals into systems, even cropping systems as well. The extreme of that biodiversity is monoculture, as you say. People go, well, get away from meat because the cows fart and they're killing the planet, and that's a whole lot of rubbish anyway, and that's another conversation. But what's the alternative? We're not eating, land-based protein. We're eating plants. How do we produce enough of that to provide enough nutrition or quantity? Well, we have to have monocultures, and and that is getting away from biodiversity. And then again, it falls into the hands of those big multinationals who rely on farmers needing all these props to hold up this system. Dirt or soil, it becomes dirt. It's basically a medium. It just stops plants from falling over. And then, in that monoculture system, which is as far from natural as possible, it needs every other input, the very prescriptive agriculture I mentioned before, to provide the nutrients, to provide the structure and whatever else. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question very succinctly, but absolutely biodiversity is key. We need animals and plants to be coexisting, and we can do it very, very simply. And the wonderful thing is, from that resilient environment and those resilient landscapes that we're producing, we are sequestering a whole lot of carbon. It's one of the most, regenerative agriculture is the most powerful tool as a collective to restoring this planet. And whoopee-doo and fantastic, we produce the most nutritiously dense food that you can put in your mouth or put in your children's mouth. So, I mean, the news is really good on that front. And I think biodiversity is king. Monoculture is, again, playing to the hands of those who rely on farmers to abdicate responsibility, buy their products, and grow crap food.
Elna here has asked a question, and then I can see that Peter has his hand up to ask a question up on the Zoom table. So I'll hop to you next, Peter. But Elna has asked, as an exporter of food staples such as wheat, how can Australia juggle the issue of producing of large volume to keep food prices low, remembering the civil unrest with the food spike in 2007 and 8, and the transition towards regenerative agriculture, reducing dependencies of products from corporations, reflecting on the current mice plague and the potential trade issues with the EU. It's a big one, but would anyone like to take a stab at that? Charlie, are you well placed to answer that one?
Can I have a go at that one?
Tammy,
yeah,
yes.
Please.
Where
I'm just trying
are
to catch up on the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there you are, Tammy. Sorry, you moved down. I could.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of us being, we're a net exporter of food in this country. I think it's depending on whether you're talking about just food or food, feed and fiber, it's 60 to 70% of what's produced here is exported. And that is the simplest way for me to think about that, is that we are actually exporting our soil and our water in the form of food, feed and fiber for the profit only of the people who do that. So that's not actually benefiting the Australian people in any meaningful way. And those monocultures that in particular the wheat crops are coming from are devastating landscapes, and they're not nourishing hungry people in Australia, that's for sure. But they're usually not nourishing hungry people elsewhere either, because the vast majority of grain exported is for feed. for animals who are kept in intensive livestock operations. So really, we should be transitioning away from that. And I'm all for keeping farmers farming, but there's no reason that you have to have a system where very few farmers own vast land holdings, produce food in ecologically unsound ways and socially unjust ways, and then export that to actually often damage other markets overseas, so that other farmers somewhere else suffer from not being able to sell into their local markets because ours comes through cheaper. There's just so many things wrong with that system that we have to look at radically moving away from large scale monocultures of grain and export. I think that's the simplest way to answer that.
Nicely answered. Thanks, Tammy. Peter, you've got your hand up. Would you like to take your microphone on? Yep, there we go.
Okay, yeah. My question is, first of all, thanks for the discussion. I'm based in Switzerland. I'm one of these international people in the food system. And first of all, I'd like the basic question is, how do I keep in touch with you all? I've been part of, for example, within the Food Systems Summit, I've been part of the AT4 leadership team on equitable livelihoods. We've been trying to get labour rights, decent work, social justice for workers and farmers on the agenda. We've not got very far, but it certainly would be sort of good to try and say, hey, can we keep in touch? Is there some mechanism that, because there's a very small group of us at the international level who work on labour issues for what we would call waged agriculture workers and workers in food processing and the like. In fact, in the Food Systems Summit, there's already 3 of us been plugging away on labour issues. It's not very many. So my question is, how do we stay in touch? Because you've obviously doing some great work. You seem very farmer focused, which is great, but there's a lot of other people in the food system who we need to think about, because it's a much broader picture. And the interesting thing at the minute, for your information, we are spending a bunch of taxpayers' money on the Food Systems Summit. And at the minute, we do not have a clue of how many workers, of how many farmers there are internationally. We know we can tell you about the number of crops. We can tell you about the number of livestock. We can't tell you about the number of people. And that tells the tale, and we need to change it. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Tammy, would you like to take that one?
I'll just be quick. I mean, Peter, you can follow Afsa's work by either joining or just subscribing to the newsletter, and we can keep you informed about what's going on. I've also just popped the link in there, the Food Systems for People website. I don't know if you're aware of it, but that's been developed by the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism in collaboration with the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty and the Via Campesina, who are spearheading the counter-mobilization. So that website is the kind of catch-all of what's happening in this movement. The ILO, I think, is involved in the summit, aren't they, Peter?
Well, we actually managed to bring the International Labour Organization in. They weren't originally in the summit. But the other problem in terms of international governance, when you come to the Committee on World Food Security, and I'm linked to that as well with the trade unions, with the labour unions, the ILO is still not a member. Okay? Right. It's been kept out. And basically, when you come back to the civil society member of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security, they do good work, but they're very peasant orientated. That's not a criticism, that's just an observation. When you come to the worker element, it's much less strong. You'll get token statements, but not much follow-up. And we have to recognize that the Food and Agriculture Organization, what we call the Rome-based agencies, they'll focus on farmers. When you come to wage workers in agriculture and food processing and the like, they don't really do much. They make token statements, but there's nothing there. They don't spend a red cent on supporting, trying to improve the general conditions of workers. And we've got to address that if we're going to make a change to sort of more sustainable food systems. We've got to broaden the scope of the work. It's too, I hate to say this, it's not a criticism, it's too farmer focused at the minute. It really is. We need more focus on farmers, we need more resources, but we need the other elements of the broad workforce bringing in, because they simply are missing.
I think that's a really important point, and I'll affirm, I agree with you entirely. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas intends to do that. But I agree with you that too often in our discussions, we're not incorporating the farm worker and food system worker parts of the system.
So
Well, if you-
Peter, I might have to just move
Send us
on
off
to
for
the
our
next-
tea party.
No, yes, exactly. It
Just
sounds like
one thing.
yes.
If you send me an email link, I will send you a report that we wrote on agriculture workers with the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Labour Organization, and the trade union, the International Food of Agriculture Workers. It'll give you the flavour. We've not succeeded in getting workers on the international agenda.
And how amazing to just add another connection to hopefully advance that that cause. Thank you so much, Peter.
And Peter, I just popped my email in the chat. So if you want to send me an email to there, I'd love to receive it.
Amazing. A quick question that's come through before I grab Sarah's question, who's got her hand up. Does Afsa work with the slow food movement at all, Tammy? Someone wants to know.
Yeah, we do, for sure. Yeah, we do. They're very different at different levels, and the international body is one thing, and there's not an Australian one anymore, a national one anymore, and there's local groups, and we absolutely do. We're often at their conferences, and we collaborate with everybody who wants good in the world. That's kind of our thing.
Nice. Okay, so Sarah, if you want to pop your mic on and ask your question.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. I guess I had the question that I typed up there about the who has sort of worked, it might be Costa, in the peri-urban space to actually, see more happen in local governments that help facilitate that rolling out, because things like the sheer money that housing can give someone is very enticing versus us having, food production right there on our doorstep. So it can be quite a battle. And I guess my friend Gilly Stewart helped with the Mornington Peninsula success story. But we've got lots of cities and lots of communities that don't have that. So that was a question, but I guess I put my hand up because I actually wanted to talk, because I'm a consultant in the broad acre scale, and wanting to make sure people understand that, yes, the conversation about broad acre, big scale wheat and whatnot is being brought up by some of us. I don't get very popular when I do it, but we have to totally rethink what we're planting in those paddocks, and we literally do have multi-species happening right now. We have people doing, all sorts of blends, multi-species we call them, that literally the header can go direct into that. And that's only limited by our imagination, I guess. And so we literally are going to do blends that literally go, say, straight into a chook food market or into the pig food, or, happy for consumers to tell us what they'd like to have in a mix that rolls out into a porridge or something. I think it's very doable now. And even grading is possible. Like, we've got seed graders that can pull 4 species back to their 4 individual species all in one pass. So we don't have to have the monoculture passed. Like the president is very, very excited.
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. I couldn't agree more. It's all about moving away from the monocultures. I'm going to have to move on because I can see a few more questions, and I know Tammy said that these things often go 10 minutes late, and that's okay. So I'm very conscious that we've only got 5 minutes.
Is there someone to talk to the peri-urban question that I had?
Yeah. So Costa, did you want to speak to that? Do you want me to repeat the question? Now, here it is. So is any of the panel aware of the local government conversations around peri-urban development being made workable as rates and policy stuff get in the way often?
Yeah, it might be a good one for Tim to tap into there as well, in terms of the work that he's doing off the back end of what Sarah was talking about as well. But yeah, look, I suppose to keep it short, I think there are things. There's definitely things. I think over in WA they're doing a lot around communal growing, giving license to people to not only establish community gardens, but grow in streets and grow verge gardens and remove those really prohibitive guidelines and policies that were just there because that space has traditionally been the domain of an engineer, and they had this dominion. Like, you can't do anything there because maybe in the next 30 years we could dig it up and you can't do anything with it. And when you go back to what Peter was talking about in terms of local food, what Charlie was talking about in terms of a change to that whole idea of commodity farming, there is land around. And I've done some work with some of the councils outside of Melbourne that are building these plans around peri-urban. And even here in Sydney, they're starting to trade areas and saying, well, that is actually good soil for growing. We will not zone that for housing. We will take that, rezone that for growing, and put the houses on a poorer quality piece of land because the houses aren't going to grow, even if we water them. So there are some of these things happening, and I think it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that the more we connect our population by getting in with our children, getting this conversation going through school gardens, community gardens, engaging through cop swap and share waste, and getting the narrative agitated and on the lips every day, then that becomes political talk, because we as constituents will demand that. And then you see people like Jess Miller and Amy Eden up in Cairns, young people joining Parliament, local government, and driving change.
Yeah, really exciting. And you mentioned Melbourne there, Sarah. You might want to check out Melbourne University is doing some good work with a peri-urban food map. A woman called Rachel Carey is involved, if you wanted to look that up. I have time for one more question. Roman, you have your hand up. Hopefully it is a question. If you'd like to pop your mic on.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to join tonight. It's been a really, really valuable session so far. There's been some really interesting points about highly processed foods and plant-based options, shifting away from that paradigm around sustainably intensifying to diversifying and creating more resilient systems. Given the impact of the food system on the environment, my understanding is solutions will need to be both in production and consumption side. So especially given that Australia consumes high rates of resource intensive products, being it sugar, highly processed or discretionary foods, dairy, meat, especially compared to other parts of the world, what role do you see sustainable diets in reducing the impact of the food system on the planet and on people's health as well?
Great question, Roman. And I think it's one of those things that we've been told to focus on the what of food for so long, when really we need to start talking about the how. How is something farmed? How far does something travel? How can we grow more at a hyper local level, on our balcony, on our windowsills? That's what sustainable food looks like, starting to really think about the how rather than the what so much. Charlie, I know this is something you're very passionate about, and you've seen just how much more carbon can be sequestered when we start to focus on biodiversity. Would you like to answer Roman's question there? And I think I'll throw to you, Costa, as well, for the hyper-urban piece too.
I was just going to add to your how with the why. Why is it good for us to be supporting farmers, growing healthier food? Why, asking questions like, why are the farmers growing that in the first place? There's had a great conversation with someone in South Australia recently, asking me, how can we use regenerative agriculture to grow our almonds? I think it was in the Riverina, and my reply was, why are you growing them there in the first place? It's not a sustainable. You need to pull water out of the river or out of the ground to do it. So again, I think it's about asking better questions, and why. I think starting with why, or in tandem with the how, is really important. And in terms of sustainable or diets, that's a great place to focus on, because again, getting back to my comments about demand, demanding food that's been grown in using healthy regenerative practices in healthy soil, and yeah. So we've got seconds left, and I think Costa's might add something to that.
Yeah, so Costa, I will come to you in a sec, but I just want to speak to Vivian for one little minute here, because it's sometimes we have these conversations about what's ideal, and yes, it's ideal for me to go directly to a biodynamic farmer to get my meat and veg, but when we talk about people who are unable to do that, what does a sustainable diet look like to people in lower socioeconomic areas, people who are living in food deserts? I mean, we can't talk perfect scenario when we also have the SOS scenario.
I think you're right. And I suppose, as I was kind of saying before, it's when you speak with people that are on lower incomes or for myriad of reasons can't access, I guess, the foods that we might think are the best in all senses of that word. I think that they are people that are locked out of the best parts of our food system for a number of really systemic reasons. It's discrimination, it's, a really long history and long list of reasons why they can't do that. And so I think I get a bit worried when you start to think about like, what is the best diet that these people could eat? Because I think that that's kind of the wrong question. I think that you need to be talking about, what is accessing food like for them? And what are these really big barriers that maybe we could collectively work towards destroying, so that they can have those choices that some of us get to enjoy, and sort of be able to make that decision for themselves, I suppose. Because I think that it becomes kind of dangerous territory to sort of say, like, us people that might be wealthier get to decide what people on the lowest incomes, who are the most marginalized, should be eating. So I guess that's my sort of redirect, I suppose, of the question. As I don't think that that's the way that I would be thinking about the question. Yeah.
And it's basically literally the topic of why we're here tonight, with the hyper-corporatization of the UN Food Summit, is then like just making sure that at every level we're allowing voices and we're hearing multiple issues, multiple access issues. For me, if I think about the most sustainable diet, yes, it's the how, yes, it's the why, and it's the access piece. It's like, why is not teaching people how to grow fruit and veg and keep chickens like a subject that is taught in schools? It's crazy. That's sustainability, when people actually are empowered to take charge of food. And everyone gets a seed kit when they're 18 and they move out of home and they get started. There are so many different solutions, and I think something that unifies everybody who spoke tonight is that we need to keep the conversation going with multiple voices. Representation is very important. Tim apologizes. He sent me a direct message to say that his computer just decided to reboot and do an update, and was very upset about the timing on that. Costa, did you want to have some final words about that sustainable diet piece in the urban setting? Costa?
Yes, sorry, I was pushing the wrong button. Yeah, look, straight off the back of what Viv just said, I think the immediate thing that comes to mind there is groups like Crop Swap, groups like Grow It Local. This is about teaching peer-to-peer, neighbour to neighbour. It's not some specialist riding in on a horse and saying, this is what you must do. And I totally understood exactly where Vivian is coming from, because I've been involved in support groups out in country and in community and seen what that does. So regardless of where it is, that idea of actually not just giving out, but but sharing the knowledge. But when the locals are sharing the knowledge, I've seen some incredible work being done in Tassie, in suburbs there, where you know the one community garden becomes this hub. Food is Free Laneway in Ballarat, another great example of people sharing food, going and taking something, breaking down that barrier, that fear or the embarrassment, whatever it may be, around the food injustice, but to then be enveloped by someone who's local, that you know and trust. Then you go to groups like Farm It Forward, who then say, well, you've got some land, we'll come and farm it, and you get the food, but you also get the knowledge to then learn how to grow the food as well. And it also contributes to the co-op. So you're helping others to then get this local food. And so I'll just leave it. Those four examples are living, breathing, thriving examples that are happening. And when we think about funding and we think about ideas of backing these local systems, they're the very moving parts. They're the gears that are already pedaling along. And if they get the wind behind them, then their potential to multiply exponentially is exciting.
Absolutely. And Roman, I hope that sort of helped give you a bit more of an idea into the complexity of what a sustainable diet is. You know, we've almost been trained to crave this neat little table where these are the foods that are bad and these are the foods that are good, and here's the little scale and everybody do your bit. But it's so much more, it's so much deeper than that, much deeper than that. And tonight, with all of these wonderful voices, I think we have all had a really exciting window into that. Tammy, would you like to offer some closing words to wrap us up tonight?
I would love to. And that would basically be to reiterate some things that have already been said, but just to give them as some like dot points. So one of those is, I've heard this from every single person here, listen first to those who are most marginalized, elevate their voices, and ask them what they believe the solutions to their problems are. And if they're not sure, work together, but make sure that their opinions and views on how this will impact them are put first. So, and the flip side of that, by the way, is if somebody's going to sell you a solution, it's quite possibly not the solution. Okay, so if you can't collectively determine it with a community, then it's probably not it. I would then say, in terms of that collectivizing, make sure you join, whether it's Afsa or Right to Food or any of the other organizations doing good work. There are plenty. Join something that gets your voice into the halls of power. We need the voices. We need to be able to say we have 1,000 members, not 100 members, all of these organizations. Then governments listen to us. And the final thing I would say, which is a super simple one that was also talked about, is sharing the stories as you're learning these things, as you're going along this journey of learning more about how the UN's work impacts on your daily life, or that working in Right to Food means listening to the people who need food first. Like, as you're learning those things, share them, share this stuff on social media, share it with your friends, share it over dinner, like just let more people know, amplify these things as you learn them, so that we can basically skill and knowledge up our society again to take back control of the food system. And I'd like to also finish by thanking all of you very much for coming and participating, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge from your places. I feel like we've done some of what we said we should do here by sharing knowledge horizontally, amplifying it out to other places. And yeah, it's a pleasure and an honor to work with all of you. So thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks to everybody for joining tonight. Thank you to Viv, Costa, Charlie, Tammy for speaking, Tim, who unfortunately had to leave us. Thank you to everyone for staying back. And remember, you can join Afsa. That's literally one of the most important things you can do. As Tammy just said, we are strong in numbers, and governments definitely start to listen when they see that grassroots organisations have a ton of members. So that is something that everyone can very easily do as a little baby step tonight. And tomorrow we start breaking it down and doing all the other bits and pieces that we can. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Night. Viva!
Bye.
Viva!